Welcome to the EDX webinar on rapid project development. Brian Cochran will cover techniques to quickly create a project, to speed up your work and bid faster on projects. Brian, the floor is yours.
Good day, everyone. This is Brian Cochran, Director of Support for EDX Wireless. Like Rory just said, today we're going to look at how to use EDX or methods for using EDX to speed up or rapidly develop projects, like for bidding situations or just to speed up your workflow. Now, in a moment here, Rory is going to give you guys a link in the chat screen that leverages a previous webinar Brian Jones did on setting up project templates, things like that to get your work going faster. So we will be leveraging that, and I'll go over that for a little bit when we do this. So to get started with, when we start working with our projects, there's a few things that we need to do that, if we have set up ahead of time, make the whole process a lot faster. One of them is a project template. When you create a project, things like your database paths, area studies that you set up, propagation model settings, basically everything in the program except for equipment can be saved down into a template. So when you open up into a new area, creating a new project, it reads all those paths and then uses the data that's there, but then all your area studies are set up, all your propagation models are set up, and all you need to do is bring in some equipment and then hit run, and you can have your study results done fairly quickly. Prior to that, however, probably one of the biggest issues that we have is getting terrain and clutter data to make sure that we have the proper data for the right area. We have a data offering called Cirrus Data, and I'm going to go ahead and launch my tile selector, and that's going to take a moment to launch in here. But this is a wonderful thing. We have data for pretty much the entire world, but especially if you're working in North America. We've got 10-meter terrain data, 5-meter clutter, and 1-meter clutter. Now, generally, we recommend the 5-meter clutter because it's a good compromise between accuracy of the data and file size. But I'm going to go ahead and expand this so you can see this and see the status bar. But this is the window that comes up. So with the tile selector, which gets installed along with SignalPro, starting with version 8.6, when you launch it, it will read your serial number and your company, and it will load your subscription if you don't have tiles. So I'm going to go ahead and load my EDX subscription here. It's reading our database, and in the moment, the whole screen is going to go yellow, showing I have a subscription for the entire world. If you didn't have that, you could select tiles and then purchase them, in which case EDX would contact you and then approve the purchase, and then you can download them. But once you've actually selected the tiles and purchased them, and we have approved the purchase, you'll get something that looks like this, showing you all the tiles that you have available. So the project we're going to work on today is in the Denver, Colorado area. And so, as you can see, I've got a subscription for all of these tiles. So all I have to do is select the tiles that I want. And in this case, I'm going to go ahead and grab 4 tiles around the Denver area. If I zoom in a little bit further, I can see more information like the counties. So, I can make sure that I'm getting the information that I need. In this case, Denver up into Boulder County, Weld County, crosses the boundaries of 4 separate tiles, which is why I have selected them. Up in the top here is a button that if I hover over it with the lines on it, this is the data set and all the data that we have available that's part of a Cirrus subscription. The default is to pick 10-meter terrain data and 5-meter clutter data. So you technically don't have to make any change to this if you don't want to. But once I've selected the tiles and the type of data that I want, I can go ahead and download it. And over on down here, it'll tell me the size of the files. So 3.4 gigabytes is the total size of the download. So you can get a sense for how big the data set is that you're grabbing and how long it takes to download. As a side note, this is basically set up so you can grab about 10 square degrees of 10-meter terrain and 5-meter clutter. If you want the 1 meter, that's basically 1 square degree at a time. And your sales engineer, or if you call it EDX support, we can walk you through that further if you're interested. But this is the nice part. If I want to rapidly develop a new project, okay, I want to do it in the Denver area, go ahead and select the tiles, click download. It's going to ask for an email so that it'll send me a link. You can go ahead and click OK. This won't take too terribly long here, but in a moment we'll see a pop-up where it's processing it. Now, while it's processing it, there's a few other things that we should have in place before we can really take advantage of this rapid prototyping process. Along with your project template, which you can go ahead and set up equipment templates inside of it, if you are requiring the use of antenna patterns, then it would help to have a little bit of time to get those patterns together before we look anywhere. Bear with me just a second while I kill that. I apologize for that. As far as the tile selector, as you can see, it's almost done encrypting the files. And in a moment here, it will give me a link. So this will finish. It'll tell me the process is completed. And then I can check my email for a link to those downloaded files. So give me just a moment here. We'll go ahead and open up a web browser. I am checking my email as we go. And I don't see that link coming across yet, so it's possible my email is a little bit slow today. Once I get that link, I'll show you what that looks like. But I have pre-downloaded some of this data for the purposes of this demonstration. I'm going to navigate my hard drive to where I have set up this data. And so here's my Cirrus clutter and Cirrus terrain. So here are the clutter files. And here are the terrain files. So if you've used EDX before, this part should be fairly straightforward. We set those up in the proper areas. The only other thing, if you're using the Cirrus data, that you need to be aware of is that there's a hidden folder called program data. In that is an EDX folder and a Cirrus folder. With the data, you'll get a manifest file. This controls your subscription. And so it just needs to be put in this location. But once we have all this work set up and done, now we can go on ahead with our rapid prototyping. I'm going to go ahead and launch SignalPro. And I'm going to go ahead and go File, New Project. Give it my project name. Here is my project template that I already have set up that I'm going to use to prototype this project. Normally, you guys will probably see generic the first time you use the software. These are other templates that you can use, but since I created my own and I wanted it to be first in the list, I'll show you where you can set that up a little bit later. I want this to be in Denver, Colorado. So if I can type correctly, okay, Denver, Colorado. So now we're leveraging the EDX template that was created before. And if you look at the link that Rory is going to give you, it will walk you through actually how to set up these templates. So there's a few things about the templates I would like to just touch base on again. It has our database paths. So the terrain, it's pointing to our Cirrus data. Clutter, pointing to our Cirrus clutter along with the proper attenuation file for that clutter data set. This was already preset ahead of time. We have a couple of radio templates. So I use this project a lot for doing fixed WiMAX and for land mobile radio. So I have a land mobile radio template in here for a tape base station, and then for fixed WiMAX, a Radwin 5000 WiMAX base station. So these are not actual pieces of equipment yet, but they are the specifications for that particular piece of equipment. So I have a generic antenna height. I've got my antenna powers, any antenna patterns that I'm using, the frequency. So it's basically a start. So when I import the equipment, I can have all the radios set up correctly. Also, as part of this template is the same thing for mobile remote units. These are the pieces of equipment that get placed during an area study. Because today I'm going to be looking more at fixed WiMAX because I can use it to look at things that would apply to land mobile radio, but that we can leverage some other features of the tool. I also have set up some CPE types, which I'll go over in a little bit more, but I've got a Radwin WiMAX subscriber unit. Okay. You'll notice that it's kind of centered around the boulder area. And as I move my cursor around the screen, if you look down in the status bar right around here, as I move my cursor around, you can see the terrain elevation changing and the land use land clutter changing because it is taking advantage of the databases that I already pre-set up. The only thing I had to make sure of when I created this new project was that I actually had data in that location for this area, which is something I had downloaded earlier. Okay. So right away, we are set up and ready to go. All we have to do is bring in some equipment. I also have my propagation model set up. That was already part of the template. And I have some area studies set up for some point-to-multipoint and for my regular area studies. Okay. So again, this is one advantage of using templates. So I would highly recommend you check out Brian Jones's webinar on how to set up those templates. So at this point, what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and try to rapidly prototype this. So the first thing I can do is I have a list of locations of where the endpoints I want to talk to in. They could be meters. They could be modems at a customer's house. They could be, whatever equipment is there. So prior to this, one of the other sets of data that I created was a list of subscriber locations. Now, going into the details of these files is just a little bit beyond the scope of this presentation. So if you have questions about how to make these, give support a call and we'll walk you through it quite easily. But basically, I used the spreadsheet editors within the program to create a file where I could put in a latitude and a longitude. And then I just populated the IDs of these particular pieces of equipment just incrementally. If you actually had the names of them or an address, you could put those as well. But it's basically a simple file with latitude and longitude. So I'm going to go ahead and import those. Right now, I'm going to go ahead. I could bring it in as a display layer through the map layers. So if I go into my map layers, I can add a layer. I could add a geographic file. And here, I could actually use one of those CSV files and bring it in just as a display layer. But in the long run, because I do actually want to try to do a point-to-multipoint system, and I have it in the correct format, I am actually going to go ahead and import these as CPEs, customer premise equipment, or subscriber units. Now you'll note I went through it kind of quickly, but in my file itself, I had an ID and a latitude and longitude. That was the only information that I had. So what's going to happen is you'll notice in this list here, there's other pieces of information like an elevation, an antenna height, lock status, transmit channels. I do not have that information in my file. So any information that is not in my file is going to be added from this template. So in this particular case, that's one of the CPE types that I had originally set up. So that's a nice thing to know, is that if you've got the latitude, longitude, and a name, you can actually fill in the rest of the information using the template feature. So I'll go ahead and import these sites. It's bringing them in now. Go ahead and click OK. I already have my CPE layer in there, and then you'll notice I've got these blue blobs. Those are all the endpoint units that I just imported. Now, I need to go ahead and position the map and zoom in a little bit more on this area. Yeah, I'll go ahead and do that. Make it, it's going to be hard to see based on the zoom level here. So the other thing I need to do at this point, we have our study grid over here. It was just arbitrarily put there when we created the new project. So I'll go ahead and redraw it around this area, setting my work area and the work area that I'm interested in. Okay, and as you can see, we've got all these meter points here. Now, I could go ahead and edit the size of these pieces of information, the CPEs, to make them smaller so they're easier to see, this, that, and the other thing, but I'm not going to go ahead and do that right now. So at this point, let's assume you just have the basic SignalPro product. These meters represent the areas I'm trying to cover. So if I'm in a bidding situation, what I can do is I can go ahead and leverage area studies to get an idea of how many individual locations I may need to just cover that area. So the paradigm I'm using today is the idea that we want to try to reach these meters, but up to a certain point, if we need more, there's going to be a break point where we're going to say, if we have X number of wireless sites, that's something affordable and that we can do. But if we need above a certain number of wireless sites, then the cost becomes ineffective. And so we'll need to look at something else, like maybe running fiber out there as opposed to doing it wirelessly. So we're kind of looking at the idea of a breakpoint. We're trying to find out how many sites that we need to see if it's something affordable for us to do. So at this point, you could conceivably go ahead and grab a transmitter site and place it somewhere that you think it might be able to cover that area. For the most part, however, we can't do that. We can't just place sites wherever we want. Another data set that I have is this, are these sites, okay? These sites I pulled from, they're for the Denver area. I went ahead and pulled them from an American Towers leasing database. So that represents a list of sites that I might be able to use. So I've gone ahead and leveraged the, just like I did with the CPEs, I've leveraged the spreadsheet editors to prepare some of this data in the EDX format. So now I'm going to go ahead and do the same thing. Got the I want to bring them in as WiMAX base stations. My file does not have header names, but I'm going to go ahead and import it. And there's my sites. So my sites database here, this file, it has a parent name, so it's the name of the location, and it has its longitude and its latitude, and that's the only information that it has in the file. So whatever other information it doesn't have, like when it creates a particular radio at that site, it is going to pull it from the settings of this Radwin 5000 WiMAX base station. Okay, so I'll go ahead and open this. It's bringing it in, so I have name, latitude, and longitude. Now when I go ahead and click OK to bring these the rest of the way into the tool, we have our sites here. And if I actually go into one of these sites, it's got the settings, it's got my frequency, it's got my system type, my transmit parameters, you know, antenna gains, antenna heights, transmitter powers. So everything is preset, so I've got a good start to this. Now right now, because I'm just starting the prototyping process, I'm using a single sector site. If it so happens that in your design, you know you're always going to use a multi-sector site, you can go ahead and set that up as part of one of these templates, and then make modifications from there, okay? So if I zoom out just a little bit, we have some sites in the area that I'm interested in, but we have all the rest of these sites that are not part of my service area. We can do a couple things at this point. If I know in the long run I'm going to be working in other areas around here, I could do a couple things. I could go ahead and just select some of these sites into a group and call this one like the Erie group. But in my case, I'm only going to be working here. I'm not going to be working anywhere else. So I actually want to delete everything else that I'm not going to use. So the easiest way to do that is to RF Systems, transmitter-based hub sites. I'm going to edit my group. And the first thing I'm going to do is go ahead and turn all of these sectors off. So I'm just going to toggle them inactive. And when I go back to the main map, see they all go kind of white because I've turned them off. Now, in this case, I'm going to go ahead and turn some of these on. So right now, I'm just picking all the sites kind of in this service area that I think are going to work. And I'll go ahead and pick these two down here. Okay, now bear with me because I'm sort of arbitrarily picking this. You probably would have a process that was a little bit more methodical to actually try to choose these ones, but so we're just going there. So at this point, I now have the sites active that I want to be looking at for coverage in this area. So the rest of them, I'll come back to my transmitter-based hub sites, edit the group again, and now I'll just go ahead and delete all of the inactive sectors from the project. Okay, so now I've just reduced my problem set to the transmitters that I want. And I'll go ahead and save the project. So what I want to do now is run a study and see what kind of coverage I have covering these points. Now, the nice part is my propagation model has been set up. My area study has been set up. All I have to do right now is go ahead and calculate my area study. Okay. This shouldn't take too long, I hope. So just bear with me while we look at this. The other thing that bears talking about here is, as part of setting up the template and setting up your propagation model, is you at some point you want to have run a few studies and setting up your propagation model ahead of time. It's not a good idea to just randomly pick a propagation model and then run it. In this case, I'd run a few studies in a similar area so that the results I was seeing seemed reasonable for the area that I was in. If you're curious about that, definitely call EDX support, and we'd be more than happy to walk you through some of the details on making sure your propagation models are set up correctly for the area that you're in. Now, another thing while this is running, this is actually taking advantage of my underlying databases. So as you can see, it's actually running really quickly for 10 transmitter sites. We've made some changes to the software over time so that it runs a little bit faster. If you're concerned about processing time, then be aware that a lot of the things that we're doing are multi-threaded. So if you can get a computer that's got multiple cores in it, a fair amount of memory, you can actually take pretty good advantage of speed and other things in terms of running the program. So we've got my study results. I'm going to go ahead and move my study up above my meters. And so if we look here, my 9-watt transmitter is covering, it looks like it's covering some of these meters up here, but it's not really hitting anything that we're after. And if I actually come in and zoom here on the Twin Peaks Mall and look at, and I don't know if it's the Twin Peaks Mall from the Twin Peaks TV show, but if I look in here, this transmitter site, I'm really not capturing very many of my points. So let's say I want to go ahead and look at that and say, well, let me go ahead and turn off this 9-watt transmitter. And I'm going to go ahead and redo this. Now, the program, unless you set it otherwise, will reuse work files. So in this case, because I haven't changed anything that would change the path loss, all it has to do is rebuild the display file. So I want to take a look at what happens if I drop out that one transmitter. Say if I drop out that one transmitter, then I lose some of these meters down here, but I'm not really losing as much as I thought. There's another thing we can do as well. So I'm going to go ahead and turn this transmitter back on. And I'm going to go ahead and rerun that study to get it in there. Okay. So as you can see, we're picking up some down here, but we're not picking up that much. So in that case, that transmitter is one we could conceivably turn off. So right now, if we were looking at this and these were the only sites that we have available, then we have a pretty good answer that we can't cover most of these sites with the transmitters that we have. Okay. So that brings up another question. At this point, what do we do from here? Well, in that case, I can go ahead and turn off a transmitter. If you had the ability to place sites wherever you wanted to, you could go ahead and drop another transmitter in somewhere. But before we do that, it might be interesting to have a little bit more information about why we're not having coverage in some of these areas. The distance between these two transmitters is only about 8 kilometers, which is well within the range of those transmitters. So here's a little trick that you can do to help you figure this out. So if I want to understand why Sienna, it looks like I'm getting some coverage right around this area, but not a lot. If I right click on it, go down into the sector and make it a focus sector, we'll see how this works depending on the resolution of my screen. Let's say I want to know, like, right down in this area here. Let me zoom in just a little bit more. So as we can see, okay, a second here. My computer is not cooperating. So if we look at the legend, green is signal level -70, -95 or higher. Yellow is 103 to -95. So green is good, yellow is okay, red is bad. So from this Sienna transmitter here, you'll notice that we have a lot of areas relatively enclosed that are not being covered very well. So what I'm going to do is I've made this a focus transmitter. I'm going to go ahead and left click and put this cursor right out in this area here. I'm going to move away from my transmitter into an empty area, right click, come down to study, profile to point. I'm going to go ahead and pick my RAD1 subscriber unit, which is what I used for the area study. It will pop up this link profile. Now, this is the reason I did the profile to point, is because my screen resolution is set so that you should be able to see everything clearly in this presentation, but it's not enough to give me enough screen real estate to be able to see this link study along with what the map is there. So what I did is I did a profile from this point to this point. There's another option for live profile to point, where if you have enough screen real estate, where as you move your cursor around, this display will change, updating the path based on where your cursor is. But in this particular case, this is my transmitter, this is my receiver. I'm using clutter pass-through loss, so the reason I'm not getting good signal out there is because at this point, the signal level is getting down to the point where it's starting to pass through fairly massive amounts of clutter. And if I put my cursor in a clutter type and let it hold there for a minute, so that's buildings. Green is developed medium intensity, which is another type of building. Gray is developed high intensity. So basically, I'm getting clobbered because I'm going through a lot of urban and or residential areas over here. So that's a quick and easy way to start exploring and saying, okay, I do have holes. Why do I have some of these holes? So at that point, we could go ahead if we wanted to and drop another site in. I could go ahead and just copy this site and then paste it, assuming I can maybe put a transmitter here right next to the freeway. And go ahead and rerun my study. Doesn't have to do anything with the older stuff. All it has to do is do the calculations for the new site and then include them in the study results. And as you can see, we got some coverage in there, but really down in this area here where we're concerned about, that didn't work so well. So at this point, we've got a pretty good handle on what's happening around here. We can go ahead and start adding more sites manually. And then we can go ahead and finish up with our reporting. So at this point, what I'd like to do is, let's say this is the best that we can do. We can come to our query menu, look at our study queries. And so for an area study, my receive power remote, I can go ahead and run a query, and it will give me give me a histogram of the signals that I have set up, but it'll give me the area that I'm looking at. Now, in this case, we are using the study grid, okay, which is this rectangle. So in that entire area, that's 1,400, almost 1,500 square kilometers. We've actually covered 412 square kilometers of it. So we've only covered 27% of our area. And this is how those signal levels break down. Over on the left-hand side here for all of our transmitters, we can actually look at how much contribution each transmitter is making. So in that particular case, what we're looking at here for the entire area, we don't have very good coverage. This is the thing, however, since all I'm concerned about is covering my meters, my blue diamonds, I'm actually looking at a lot of area and reporting a lot of area that I'm not responsible for. So there's a little trick that we can do, which is kind of cool. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come to my draw menu, and I'm going to draw a polygon. Okay. So I'm going to paint with a broad brush here, but I'm going to go ahead and draw a polygon around this area. I'm going to come back and draw another polygon around this area. I'm going to do that for the other areas that I'm interested in. Okay, so I have all these polygons here, and they are all selected. If they were not selected, I would come to my edit menu and choose select all objects. But now that I have them, I'm going to right click on one of the lines and choose save to file. And at this point, I'm going to go ahead and save it as my point-to-multipoint service area boundary. Okay. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to rerun my area study, but I'm going to use these boundaries as a filter. Problem is right now, if I rerun the study and do that, it is going to try to reuse the work files that it has, including the display files. So I need to do one thing to clear those out. If I come to Studies, Study Preferences, and choose Reset All Working Files, it's going to delete all the working files. However, I don't want to delete the underlying work files because I don't want to take the time for that to happen. All I really need to do is delete the display file that's the study results. So here's a little trick not everybody knows about. So if I want to do that and redo this boundary, if I come into my project, so this is my project, Denver RD. If I come down to the MXX folder, which is the display file, I'm just going to go ahead and delete these files. Okay. Then I'm going to go ahead and refresh my screen. It'll tell me that the MXX file is gone. It needs to rebuild it. It can't, so those are gone. But my underlying study files are still there. So now I can go ahead and come back to my area study, modify my area study. Now I'm going to use this polygon filter. I'm going to point to that point-to-multipoint SAB. And now all I should have to do is rerun that study. All it has to do is rebuild the working file. And now you'll see my area studies are now restricted to inside that polygon. So assuming my service area boundaries truly represent the area I need to cover, now if I come back to my study queries, I want to use polygon file. Now if I rerun the query, this looks a lot better. Okay, so out of all of that, I've actually covered 47% of my area. My coverage in terms of my thresholds is still pretty poor, but it's a lot more accurate representation. And if we look over here at the area, the contribution for the transmitters, we can see how the transmitters are contributing to that total coverage. Okay, so those are some pretty cool, some pretty interesting ways to do that. So in this particular case, if this is all I could do, then I could show the customer that right now there's not much else we can do because we can't put any more sites in, or it's going to be too expensive to put those sites in. There's another thing I want to look at that we can do here. So in some cases, you may be able to get other lists of locations. And especially if you're working with companies like utilities or things like that, that have a large number of, say, towers or like light poles, other things that you can actually mount things on. We have this idea of a tower pole database. Okay? And so I went ahead and created one. So I'm going to go ahead and point to that file that I created. Okay, so this is something I would have gotten from, like, say, a utility or a tower leasing place or something like that. So I'm going to go ahead and open that. I'm going to go ahead and load that. So there's 762 locations. And at this point, I'm going to go ahead and come into my map layers. I'm going to add a layer, and I'm going to go ahead and add that tower layer as a database layer. I'm going to go ahead and hide my receive power study. So now all of these black dots represent potential pole locations. So in this case, if I had a database like that, then what I could do is go ahead and come in and start adding sites. So like this ABAE that I put in there, maybe I can't put it there, but I can put it on one of these dots. I'm going to hold down the Shift key, left click and hold, and I can drag that transmitter to that location. And maybe I can go ahead. So at this point, maybe I can go ahead and just start putting some other sites in on some of these locations. Now, the reason I'm pasting it out here and shift dragging it over is because I have so much equipment here, like the CPEs, that it's not easy to move around. So anyways, with that type of database, it's easy to go ahead and start putting individual sites in there. Go ahead and rerun the study. It only has to rerun it on those 3 new sites. So that's a quick and easy way for you to start looking at getting coverage for some of these areas. So we'll just go ahead and let this finish a little bit. Okay, so putting those 3 sites in there, obviously we got quite a bit better coverage in there. We could go ahead and turn 1 or 2 of these off and then compare back and forth between their coverage and see how that works. So for area studies, that's kind of a quick and easy way for you to get some base information about coverage of your area. Okay. We used an area study to quickly do that. We went ahead and used polygons to restrict the coverage area, and then the queries to look at what the numbers are, so that we can get a better idea of actual hard numbers to be able to give to our customer or whoever it is we're doing this design work for. Now, at this point, this is still painting with a broad brush. This would be more like a preliminary or bidding phase, not necessarily the final build-out phase. Okay. From here, we're going to switch this up a little bit and start looking at the kind of the point-to-multipoint part of it. So while using an area study, we can kind of get a sense of the areas that we can cover. And I can put more transmitter sites in here to say cover this whole service area. At some point, especially with point-to-multipoint, we may need more information, or we want more study results based on actual connections to these particular CPEs. Okay. There's also another thing here to kind of look at. When we're doing our area study, we're doing a radial line method. So we're looking at a bicycle, kind of a bicycle wheel around the transmitter. So we're going around the transmitter. These are all the spokes. This is how far out along the spoke that we're going, and the study point spacing that we're placing out along those spokes. So that's quite a large number of calculations to be able to paint this area study. Whereas with point-to-multipoint, if we're looking at these individual subscriber units, then all we have to do is the calculation between that and that particular subscriber unit. And since there's a lot less subscriber units than there are random points in the area study, multi-point studies can actually go a lot faster than an area study. Really kind of depends on what you're after. But at this point, I'm not necessarily worried about speed. I'm worried about the information I'm getting out of this. In this particular case, the only piece of information I'm getting is my signal level, because that's the area study that I've run. So what I'm going to do is now, if I come in here, I could go ahead and run a multi-point study, which would then kind of do the same thing as the area study, but to each point. But I actually want more information than that. I want to leverage more information than that. So if you have one of the additional modules, like say the mobile cellular module, WiMAX, or LTE, you'll actually get access to this multi-point backhaul network module. It comes with any of the other modules that you would buy. So I'm going to come down here, and we have this feature called Assign Servers and Channels. It can do a lot more than what I'm about to make it do, but I'm just going to go ahead and set the servers only. I'm going to ignore most of the stuff on the left side here, but on the right-hand side, this is where it gets interesting. I'm going to try to connect these subscriber units to the various base stations. But when I do that, I want a minimum signal level of at least -95. So in doing the calculations, if any of those endpoints falls below -95, it won't assign it to one of my base stations. Okay. The other thing is I can also say, along with that, I want a specific carrier to noise ratio. So using straight signal level is fine, but if you have a number of things that are on the same channel, you want to make sure that you're not running into any interference problems, so you can set some criteria for that. In this case, I'm going to set that down very low, because I don't really care about interference at this point. Channels to use, I can ignore for the moment, but I can also tell it how many servers to consider, especially if I have a high density of servers in a given area. The other part of it is, though, that can be kind of cool, is right now I could go ahead and say it's not capacity limited, but let's say that I know that my radios can only handle a certain number of subscriber units. In this particular case, you're just going to have to take my word for it, but the Radwin base stations can handle about 60 subscriber units connected to it. If I want to be a little conservative and give myself some headroom, I'm going to go ahead and say I can go ahead and assign 50 subscriber units per sector before I start running into bandwidth issues. You could also do the same thing with traffic. Down below here, there's an overbooking percentage. So if you can overbook the channels, you can use that. I'm going to set that to 0 because I don't want any overbooking. So basically what I'm going to do, it's like doing my area study to each individual point, but I've also set criteria about what will work and what won't. And we'll go ahead and start this frequency planning. Now, unfortunately, this is going to take just a little bit of time, hopefully not too much. So at this point, I believe Brian Jones is on the call, and I believe Rory is on the call. So while this is finishing up, and it shouldn't take too long, if they have anything they'd like to throw out at the moment, I'll open the floor up to them. But otherwise, this is going quickly enough. We can probably just sit here for just a minute or two in some companionable silence. I guess the other thing I can say about this right now is if your system did have channelization where you could assign separate channels to different sectors, you could go ahead and use this to not only figure out which CPE which base station the CPE is going to talk to, you could also go ahead and assign those servers and set channels for the CPEs at that base station as well. So this additional module really can be quite useful if you're doing this type of work. If you're just doing area studies like land mobile radio, this obviously is not a value to you, but it's nice to know about. So it analyzed the base stations. Now it's looking at the CPEs. So from here, we can get some basic information about it. So we have 12 servers, okay? We're saying we can use 50 servers per base, or 50 CPEs per base station. And right now, it's telling us we were able to assign 2,914 CPEs, but 1,568 of them were not able to get an assignment, okay? So I'm going to go ahead and save this. And then when we come back to our main map, there's another thing I can do here, is I can go ahead and potentially look at the CPE hub links. So if I go ahead and hide a couple things here and then zoom in, and let me make one other change to make it a little easier to see. So my blue diamonds, I'm going to highlight that layer, and to make them a little less, I'm going to make them transparent so they kind of fade out. So there we go. So now you can see all of these blue diamonds that have a line back to a base station, they've been assigned to that base station. All of these blue diamonds that don't have that link have not been assigned for various reasons, either because of capacity or because of signal level constraints. Okay. Then the other thing I can do is at this point, I can run my multi-point study, which I've set up to be just like my area study. I want to run the study based on the assigned server. So I'll go ahead and run that study. It's going to tell me there's CPEs with unassigned server. Yes, I know that. But I'll go ahead and click that OK, and I'll run it. And this is another one where it's going to take a few minutes to finish that study. But once it finishes, not only will I get the signal levels on the connected CPEs, just like my area study, but then under the query menu, we'll be able to go in and look at some more information, like how many CPEs are actually assigned to each base station. So we'll just let this finish for a moment. Okay, it'll take just a few more minutes to finish here, but we're going along pretty good. As you can see, this is still running pretty quickly. We're about 50 minutes into this presentation, and I've already done quite a bit of work with my area studies. I'm actually doing quite a bit of work with looking at my meters. So that's pretty much the idea. What I want to leave you guys with is, with some certain setup ahead of time, you can actually get quite a lot of work done in a very reasonable and quick amount of time. And we're just about finished here. Okay, and we have our results. Okay, I could go ahead, just like everything else, I could change the size. My color levels are basically green is good, yellow and red like before. So in this particular case, if we come look up at this area here, pretty much if it got an assignment, it's good signal level. Because remember, we set our threshold to -95. So that's why we're not seeing any other colors, because it only assigned things that met our -95 threshold. But under the query menu, I could still do my study queries. I do my multi-point study. Okay. The interesting part here is now, instead of terms of area, it looks at points. So we had 600 total points that were assigned. 518 of them actually got good signal level, And we can again see, so out of those, 86% of the total assigned points. This is not exactly ideal. We'd have to set some different criteria because it's only showing us the values for the ones that were connected, and the ones that were connected did have good signal levels, so just bear that in mind. But also along with that, we can get some information about the end places, like number of CPEs served per hub. And if you'll notice, all of these, except AD, we hit our capacity. So there's 3,800 that were unassigned. A big part of this is probably because we've hit our assignment. So at that point, we could then go back in to this particular transmitter, and we could add a couple sectors, like 4 of them. So if I leave these omni, then it's neither here nor there at the moment. But if I have 50, by adding 4 sectors, especially if I sectorized them, I could 50, 100, so I could pick up an additional 150 CPEs at this particular site. By doing that, rerun the assignment under here, rerun my multi-point study, and then I could look at it again and see how many extra of those I'm picking up. If I also went back and for my assigned surface and channels, instead of said -95, if I set that down to -120, then when I ran my multi-point study, I could actually see the CPEs that had good connectivity, had marginal connectivity, and that had really poor connectivity. So there are a couple of different ways you can do this depending on the information that you're trying to get out of it. So at that point, if this is all I could do, then I'm done. Now, obviously, for most of you, you would spend more time maybe putting a few more sites in there till you hit that threshold criteria. I've said, well, if I can only really afford, 100 sectors, and it's going to take me over 100 sectors to actually cover all this, then you could report that to the customer. So at this point, what I'd like to do is turn this back over to Rory and see if people have any questions. Does that sound good, Rory?
Yeah, absolutely. So, Brian, I mean, it's pretty amazing. You've taken this from nothing and you've created an entire project and run a bunch of studies here in literally an hour, which is really cool. One question that came in was, now that we have, we've rapidly created this project, what is the process, or what kind of tips do you have to quickly get this data out of the SignalPro software and getting that into something that the customer can then visualize for display purposes with their customers?
I do not mean to make this complicated. That's a little bit of a tricky question. So it really depends on what information that you want. But broadly speaking, for my area studies, when I was running those, you can export the display in various formats. A common one these days is actually to export it to Google Earth. So if I have my area study here, I go ahead and select Google Earth, click OK. It exported it, I think. You can also do it from the map layers, and that's where I tend to do it because it gives you a little bit more control over it. So like where you want to put the file. Otherwise, I think it just puts it in your project. So it also gives you control over a few different things. Do I want to go ahead and include the locations? I'm going to go ahead and do that for the moment. So it just created the KMZ file. I don't have Google Earth on this computer, but there's the KMZ file. So you could send that to a customer and they could look at it in Google Earth. You can also do the same thing from the map layers with your transmitter-based hub site layers. You can export that to Google Earth. I think, let's see, you could do that with your tower locations, the tower pole database, to show them where potential sites are. You can also do that with your CPEs. So most of these things you can export as a KMZ, KML. Depending on the thing, especially with your studies, you can also export them to like shape files. So if you were really good with things like QGIS or ArcView, you could export the study results and then correlate them with, like, say, a demographic database, like number of households or other information that you can use in those types of programs. More basically, you could go ahead and print the screen. So we have this print preview mode. So you get the white area, which is your printable area, which is based on your printer setup. So you can go ahead and zoom in to where you want to sort of get all that. And then the other thing is using that. If you go ahead and show the legend, you'll notice that this printable area is going to get narrower. So the white area is your printable area. Everything else is where the legend is going to be. And then you can go ahead and just print that. So I can come in and look at my print preview. This is going to take a minute. So you could actually print maps this way, just directly print them out there. Other things, you can also go ahead and save as image. You can basically just, it'd be the same thing like printing it, but you could actually save it in just about any graphic format that you wanted to for inclusion in a report. As far as the equipment parameters, a little trickier. If you come down to the spreadsheet editors and, like they say, the sector data for your base stations, you can give them basic information. So this is an extremely long list. Brian Jones's webinar goes into this a little bit more detail, but you can go ahead and modify the columns to show very specific things. So, like, let's say I just wanted the site, the latitude, longitude, and the frequency. I could go ahead and restrict the display to that. And then if I export this, I can type. Then what I can do, at least some of that basic information that's available with the spreadsheet editors, I can export that, where I could include that in various tables and formats like that. So that, in a nutshell, is how you start getting that information out. Beyond that, if you have more specific applications and more specific information that you want, I would suggest calling technical support here at EDX, and we can walk you through it. The other thing, though, for the queries, for your study queries we were talking about before, once you run one of these queries, you can actually print this to a PDF file, or you can save these to an Excel file and get the results of the query. So most of this information you can at least export to a table format, or you can export the display results in various usable formats.
Well, perfect. Thank you for answering that. It appears like that is the only question that we had come in. If anyone out there has questions that they have for follow-up to this webinar or anything that was shared in chat here with the previous webinar that Brian Jones did, you can reach out to support@edx.com or give us a call as well. And we're more than happy to assist you and answer any questions for anything that you've learned today and any other questions that you may have. Brian, do you have any closing comments?
The only closing comments I would have is, a lot of times the software is a little bit like, say, Adobe Photoshop. It has a lot of capabilities in it, but sometimes figuring out what those capabilities are can be Oh, I don't want to say challenging, but depending on how often you use the software, there's a lot of stuff that's easy to forget. So never hesitate to reach out to EDX support and ask those questions. That's what we're here for. We have a vested interest in making sure that you can use the software the way you want to do your work. So by all means, please give us a call. We're more than happy to help.
Well, perfect. Thank you, everyone, for joining the webinar. We will be here to answer any questions, and just hope everyone has a wonderful day. Thanks so much.